Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep today into, well, one of history's most compelling and frankly enduring mysteries.
Yeah.
The story of Kaspar Hauser. You often hear him called the child of Europe.
It's a narrative that it really defies any easy explanation, doesn't it? It blends, historical fact with just layers and layers of speculation and cultural myth-making, too, that have stuck around for, nearly 200 years now.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we've pulled together a really fascinating stack of sources to help us navigate it all. We've got a scientific paper looking at dermatology and genetics.
Interesting angle.
Yeah, and a detailed historical synopsis, a deep dive into how his story's been interpreted in literature over the years,
Right.
and even a recent press release on the absolute latest genetic findings.
So a real mix. It's a perfect example, really, of how one single historical fact can be examined from just so many different angles, across different fields, different centuries.
Exactly. So our mission here is to go through these materials, try and pull out the most important facts, the main theories, and maybe some of those surprising little insights, all to help you understand who Kaspar Hauser might have been, the enigma surrounding him, and, well, why his story still grabs our imagination today.
Okay. Where should we start? His appearance.
Let's jump right in there. Picture this. It's May 26, 1828. You've got this seemingly lost, bewildered young man, maybe around 16 years old, who just appears in Tallow Square, Nuremberg.
Right. And he can barely walk. His clothes are described as odd, and he's clutching a couple of letters.
His first interactions with people were, well, striking. Communication was incredibly hard.
Yeah, almost nonverbal at first, wasn't he? Just repeating these phrases like, I want to be such one as my father was, or I want to be a horseman, stuff like that.
But then you give him a pen and paper, and he can write his name, Kaspar Hauser.
Which is strange in itself. And those letters, they're immediately the source of suspicion, aren't they?
Totally. One claimed to be from, like, a poor day laborer.
Saying he'd found the child as a baby, raised him in isolation, and was now delivering him at age 16 to a cavalry division.
And the other one, this so-called young maiden note, was supposedly from his mother.
Explaining she had to give him up. Father dead, couldn't feed him, the usual story.
But almost instantly, the authorities, the criminalists, the handwriting experts, graphologists, I guess they were called then, they spotted major red flags.
Like what specifically?
Well, the handwriting on both letters, identical. The ink didn't look like it was 16 years apart. The paper used for the supposedly older letter had a watermark from a mill that, well, it didn't even exist back in 1812, his claimed birth year.
Okay, so that's pretty damning evidence right there.
And the cavalry school he was supposedly being delivered to, it wasn't even in Nuremberg in 1812.
So it really feels less like a genuine backstory and more like a hastily put together cover story.
Exactly. And there's that really chilling detail in the laborer's letter, too. If the captain couldn't keep him.
What was it? Something about...
Drive him away or hang him in the chimney.
Ugh. That paints a really disturbing picture. Deliberate abandonment. Or maybe even worse.
Definitely feels sinister.
And the municipal physician, a Dr. Prue, he examined Kaspar early on, right? His assessment was quite important.
It really was. He concluded Kaspar was, and I'm quoting here, neither insane nor cretinous, but has obviously been kept by force and in the most detrimental manner from all human and social upbringing.
So a professional opinion basically confirming that this wasn't just neglect, but likely the result of a serious misdeed, a crime.
It solidified that suspicion.
Yeah.
And even the name itself, Kaspar Hauser. It feels loaded with meaning, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, Kaspar, sometimes linked to the Magi, can mean guardian of the treasure, and Hauser could suggest homebody, someone kept inside, or maybe even hint at a connection to a noble house, a house.
Interesting. It's like the mystery is sort of embedded right there in his name from the start.
Feels that way.
So what happened to him initially? Where did he go?
Well, first, he was housed in the Nuremberg jail's Luggensland Tower. The jailer there, Andreas Hiltel, actually started teaching him some basics.
Okay.
But then he was moved into the care of George Friedrich Dahmer.
Dahmer. He's a key figure, a philosopher, a teacher, kind of an interesting character himself.
Right, and under Dahmer's guidance, Kaspar's learning just exploded. It was, well, almost unbelievably fast.
He picked up language skills incredibly quickly.
Yeah, learned to read, write, do arithmetic. He even learned chess and piano, drawing, watercolors.
Wow. Which must have raised questions, surely, like, Was he just exceptionally gifted? Or did this rapid learning maybe contradict the whole idea that he'd been kept in complete isolation his whole life?
That's the tension, exactly. Did it suggest a different past entirely?
And Dahmer also reported some really remarkable sensory abilities, didn't he? Almost uncanny.
He did.
Mm.
Claimed Kaspar could read and distinguish colors in almost total darkness. Yeah, and spot tiny berries from like 100 steps away.
Oh.
His sense of smell was apparently so acute he could barely walk through a cemetery.
Wow.
And he could supposedly feel different metals, even a diamond, just by touch or proximity.
That's extraordinary. Hard for us to even imagine today. And wasn't there something about homeopathy, too?
Yes. Dahmer was interested in homeopathy, and he noticed Kaspar reacted really strongly to remedies just by, like, smelling or touching the bottle.
Which Dahmer then told Samuel Hahnemann about, the founder of homeopathy.
Exactly. Hahnemann apparently saw it as validation of his theories. But these reported heightened senses, they're just so unusual.
They really are. Very difficult to square with everything else we think we know.
So things are already pretty strange, but then it gets political, right?
Very much so. Mayor Binder's public notice on July 7, 1828, that really lit the fuse.
What did it say?
He openly speculated that Kaspar might belong to a noble family, that he'd been deprived of his birthrights, and that, well, that immediately sparked the most famous theory of all.
The hereditary prince theory.
Bingo. The claim was that he was actually the son of Grand Duke Karl Ludwig Friedrich von Baden and Stephanie de Beauharnais.
Born in 1812.
Right. And then secretly swapped with a dying baby so that a different branch of the family, the Hochbergs, could eventually inherit the throne.
And after the swap, the theory goes, he was held in solitary confinement until someone just dumped him in Nuremberg in 1828.
The political stakes, according to the sources we looked at, were incredibly high.
How so?
Well, you had the Grand Duke's uncle, Ludwig, who apparently wanted the throne. Countess Hochberg was maneuvering for her own sons. There were even whispers that Bavaria might try to reclaim territory if the main Baden line died out, and Kaspar's supposed connection to Napoleon through his mother, Stephanie.
Right, she was related to Napoleon.
Yeah, that gave the whole thing a significant European motif. It hinted that this wasn't just a local squabble, but maybe a conspiracy involving major political players, like Prince Metternich, maybe, who was a big opponent of Napoleon.
And Lord Stanhope often gets mentioned here too, right?
Yeah.
Suspected of being some kind of political agent for the Baden court later on.
Yes, his involvement is definitely a key part of the later intrigue.
Okay, so this huge political theory is swirling around him. And then the scientific sources, like that dermatology paper, add another layer, right? With the vaccination clue.
That's a fascinating detail. The paper points out that Kaspar Hauser had clear cowpox inoculation scars, Jennerian vaccination reported on both arms.
And vaccination policies were rolling out across Europe then.
They were. It became mandatory in Bavaria in 1807, Austria in 1812, Baden and Hesse in 1815. The paper notes places like Ansbach, before compulsory vaccination, had really high smallpox deaths. Afterwards, pretty much none.
So for someone supposedly born in Bavaria around 1812, having vaccination scars by 1828 wouldn't have been that unusual, maybe even expected.
Well, that's the point. The sources suggest it would have been relatively common in Bavaria by then, not necessarily a mark of nobility like it might have been elsewhere earlier on.
But here's the kicker, the paradox the paper highlights.
Yeah. How could he have been vaccinated?
Exactly. If he was kept in complete isolation his entire life before 1828, how did that happen?
Because the standard practice involved either arm-to-arm inoculation, which requires contact, or visiting these permanent vaccination centers, like the one in Munich Town Hall, which opened in 1809.
So the paper argues that getting him vaccinated secretly while keeping him totally isolated would have been highly unlikely.
It's a specific medical finding that directly challenges the core part of his origin story, the one told in those letters. How could he be both completely isolated and vaccinated?
It really deepens the mystery, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And with all this attention, all these theories flying around, he became a target. There was that first assassination attempt.
Yeah, shockingly violent. October 17th, 1829 at Dahmer's house.
He was hit on the forehead, wasn't it, with something like a cleaver?
Right. And he reported the attacker yelled, "You must die before you get away from Nuremberg." Kaspar thought it was his old jail warden.
But no one was ever caught.
No, not definitively. But the attack was definitely real. And Dahmer himself got death threats too. It shows how dangerous things had become for Kaspar.
So they had to move him for safety, first to the Beberbach family, then to Baron von Tücher, who became his legal guardian.
And then Lord Stanhope arrives on the scene.
Ah, yes, the British nobleman, May 1831, shows up with this sudden interest.
Lavishing gifts, really pushing the idea that Caspar was of noble birth.
Becomes his official foster father, moves him to Ansbach. His motives are, let's say, highly debated.
How so?
Well, some sources think he was genuinely interested, trying to help. Others paint him as a political agent, maybe working for the Baden court.
To discredit Caspar or control the narrative somehow, possibly linked to Metternich.
It's suggested, and Stanhope definitely turned on Caspar later, writing things that really defamed his character after his death.
Another really crucial figure around this time was Anselm Ritter von Feuerbach.
Yes, the jurist, president of the Ansbach Court of Appeals, a major legal mind.
And he was an early supporter, right?
Yeah.
Saw Caspar as this unique human case study.
Absolutely. He became a key protector and a major proponent of the Prince theory, his 1832 book.
Kaspar Hauser, or The Example of a Crime Against the Soul Life of the Human Being, a foundational text for the whole mystery.
It really is. Though Feuerbach was careful, apparently, he kept the really explicit political stuff out of the published book.
But he wrote a secret memoir with his full theory.
Exactly, sent it to the Queen Dowager. The sources suggest Stanhope somehow found out about Feuerbach's research.
And Feuerbach then became too dangerous politically.
Yes, the implication. And then, tragically, Feuerbach dies. Suddenly. In 1833, in agonizing pain.
Poisoning was suspected, wasn't it? Notes found, maybe arsenic?
Yes, and plans were made for an exhumation to check, but the source says, at the last moment, this was prevented.
Wow.
So while it's not scientifically proven poisoning, the circumstances are incredibly suspicious. Everything points to it, as one source puts it, happening just before the final attack on Caspar himself.
Which came just months later, December 14th, 1833, in Ansbach.
He was lured to the court garden. Someone promised him news about his mother.
And then he was attacked, stabbed violently with a dagger, terrible injuries through the pericardium, lung, diaphragm, liver.
Just horrific. And what happened right after is so central to the whole controversy around his death, isn't it?
It really is. Despite these awful wounds, he somehow manages to drag himself, 600 steps back to his teacher Meyer's house.
But Meyer, he didn't believe him. Meyer had become quite skeptical of Caspar by then, apparently.
Yeah, he doubted the story and actually went back to the garden himself.
And that's where the pouch was found, with the note inside.
Right. A note written in mirrored script. It said something like, Hauser will be able to tell you exactly what I look like. To spare Hauser the trouble, I will tell you myself where I come from.
And Meyer immediately jumped on that, didn't he? Insisted Caspar must have written it himself.
He did. Pointed to homework where Caspar had practiced mirrored writing.
But later analysis proved Meyer wrong.
Conclusively, graphologists later showed the letter was not in Caspar's handwriting.
So the story that Caspar faked the attack and maybe stabbed himself or it was suicide, that was pushed really hard, but it seems it wasn't true.
The source says that lie was vehemently put out into the world. It effectively provided cover for whoever the real killer was.
And Caspar himself, he lingered for a few days.
Yeah, died on December 17th after hours of questioning. His last words are reported to include forgiving no one, saying why no one has done anything to me.
Also, the monster was stronger, and he asked his pastor to pray for his murderer.
He was buried on December 20th. Apparently a lot of townspeople came.
And the gravestone epitaph sums it all up, doesn't it? Hic esset Kaspar Hauser, enigma sui temporis ignota nativitas occulta mors.
Here lies Kaspar Hauser, an enigma of his time, unknown birth, mysterious death.
And the commemorative stone at the attack site is even more cryptic. Hic occultus occulto octasis est.
Here a mysterious person was mysteriously killed. Or maybe even, here the occult was killed by the occult.
Yeah, the mystery literally carved in stone.
And it certainly didn't fade. Kaspar Hauser became this immediate, pan-European sensation.
The child of Europe, the lost boy from Nuremberg. He's now seen as the sort of patron of virtually all feral children, although that label itself is pretty complicated, given the circumstances.
Definitely. And his story has had this just astonishing cultural impact, inspiring countless works for, almost 2 centuries now.
Novels, dramas, poems by really major figures, Paul Verlaine, R.M. Rilke, George Trakell's Kaspar Hauser song, which is incredibly powerful.
Songs too, like Suzanne Vega's. And films, Werner Herzog's version is probably the most famous.
The Enigma of Kaspar Hauser, yeah. And Peter Sayre did a more recent historical drama, even opera and ballet. The list just goes on and on.
What's really fascinating, looking at the literary analysis source, is this recurring theme or motif.
Which is?
Kaspar Hauser as this mythic figure,
Huh.
often seen through the lens of innocence, sacrifice, sometimes even portrayed as a kind of like latter-day Messiah figure.
Wow, can you give an example?
Sure. Think of Jacob Wasserman's 1908 novel. It pictures him as almost Adam-like in his innocence, a mirror of untarnished humanity.
Okay.
And his story is framed like a passion where he makes a voluntary sacrifice, and his death gets these Christ-like overtones, even cosmological signs mentioned.
That's intense. What about Trockel's poem?
Trockel's poem moves from this kind of paradisal nature setting into the hostile city, but Caspar's purity stays intact. He's called the righteous one.
Uh-huh.
And his death is portrayed almost like a calm, saintly sinking. Silvery it sank down, the head of the unborn. It's beautiful, but haunting.
And there were even more sort of spiritual interpretations?
Yeah, within anthroposophy, figures like Rudolf Steiner saw Hauser as a higher being carrying the Christ impulse.
Seriously?
Yeah. They believed his sacrificial death had cosmic significance, maybe even preventing bad historical outcomes like the Third Reich.
That's a very specific interpretation.
It is. They even equate him with the risen Christ, using the phrase, "the one you are seeking is not here." Though the source we read rightly points out this view kind of ignores his very real human suffering.
Right. You can't just gloss over that. What about more recent stuff? Does the myth-making continue?
It seems more complex now. David Constantine's 1994 poem, for instance, still explores that mythic potential. He calls Hauser a cowardly Jesus at one point. Talks about Stanhope's maybe messianic hopes for him, Hauser being crucified by facts.
Okay.
But Constantine refuses to just project redemption onto him. Instead, he focuses on the affront that Hauser's innocence represented to the world.
Ah, so more about the world's reaction to him.
Exactly. And he connects Caspar's suffering directly to vulnerable people today, highlighting, and this is a quote, the need, the helplessness, the infinite requirement of redress. It puts an ethical responsibility back on us, the reader.
That's powerful. So the story clearly resonates way beyond just the historical puzzle.
Absolutely. But the attempts to solve that puzzle scientifically haven't stopped. There's this whole history of genetic analyses.
Right. Starting back in, 1996, with that blood stain on his trousers.
Yeah. That study claimed no match with the Baden maternal line, said he wasn't the prince.
But the source notes the authenticity of that specific blood sample was questioned right away, called pure speculation.
Exactly. So, cloud of doubt over that one. Then came the 2012-2002 study.
Using pooled hair samples this time? Confirmed to be his?
Yes, 100% certainty they were Hauser's hairs. And crucially, the genetic code from these samples did not match the 1996 blood stain.
Okay, so that pretty much rules out the 1996 result. What did the hair show compared to the Baden family?
Well, they found a high level of congruency with descendants of the House of Baden, but it wasn't a perfect match.
Leading to that very unsatisfying conclusion.
Cannot say that Kaspar Hauser is the hereditary prince, nor can one say that he is not. Left the door wide open, basically.
Frustrating. But now, there's a new study from 2024.
Just out, published in iScience. This one uses much more modern, super-sensitive methods. They tested single hair shafts from reliable collections.
Okay, single shafts, that sounds more precise. And what did they find?
Well, first, they confirmed the result of the 1996 study, finding that specific genetic marker called mitotype W. But they did it with extremely high confidence, like 99.99994%, in the authenticity of the sample they tested this time.
Okay, so mitotype W seems solid for Hauser. How does that compare to the Baden line?
Crucially, their analysis shows that Kaspar's mitotype W, which is mitochondrial DNA, passed down the maternal line, clearly deviates from the mitotype found in the Baden lineage descendants, which is H1Bs.
So, what does that mean in plain English?
According to the press release on this study, this finding scientifically rules out a maternal relationship to the House of Baden.
Wow, so he wasn't Stephanie de Beauharnais' son.
That's what this latest science strongly indicates. It really challenges the most popular version of the hereditary prince theory.
But, and this is a really important but, isn't it?
Absolutely. The authors themselves emphasize this. Just because he wasn't the prince, maternally speaking.
Doesn't suddenly mean he was a fraud who faked the whole thing or stabbed himself in the garden.
Exactly. He could still very much have been the victim of a terrible crime, just maybe not the specific one involving the Baden succession that everyone focused on.
So here we are, almost 200 years on. We've had intense historical investigation, countless theories, all this cultural and literary analysis, And now the latest genetic
And
science.
the true identity, the real origin, the exact circumstances of Kaspar Hauser's life and, well, his violent death,
Yeah.
they're still fiercely debated.
It's just this incredible tapestry, isn't it? Woven from a few solid facts, but mostly layers of intrigue, passionate belief, deliberate deception, horrific violence, and this enduring myth-making.
It really shows the profound power of an unresolved human story.
And it clearly still resonates with us, with you listening, because it just taps into such fundamental human questions.
That innate quest for identity. Who am I? Where did I come from? Where am I going?
Yeah. And the devastating effects of isolation, of trauma, what innocence really means in a complex, often brutal world.
Our deep desire for meaning, maybe even redemption in the face of suffering.
Yeah.
And that sense of ethical responsibility we feel towards people who are vulnerable.
The latest genetic evidence seems to, well, scientifically close the door on the most popular theory, at least regarding his mother.
Right. But given the whole history, the conflicting evidence over time, the sheer human drama of it all, and these rich layers of meaning that cultures have built around him.
Does the enduring power of the Kaspar Hauser story maybe lie precisely in that lack of a final, universally accepted answer?
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What does our continued fascination with this child of Europe tell us about our own deepest questions and desires for meaning?
This raises an important question.